The Everglades stretched endlessly ahead, a maze of water and grass, where the world seemed to breathe at its own pace. The dense mangroves swayed like silent sentinels as an eerie fog rolled in from the horizon. The air was thick and humid, the scent of earth and saltwater hanging in the silence. Here, amidst the labyrinthine waterways, only the truly resilient could thrive. This land belonged to the creatures that called it home, a forgotten world of shadows where the rules of time and space seemed suspended. Deep in the heart of this remote sanctuary, an old man named Elias had taken refuge. For years he had worked tirelessly to protect the Everglades and its inhabitants, dedicating his life to the wildlife that existed within this vast expanse. He was a solitary figure, his face weathered from years of exposure to the elements, his hands gnarled from years spent working in the wetlands. His only companions were the animals, those that moved silently through the shadows, and the ever-present water that carved its way through the landscape. Elias knew this land better than anyone. He had walked these marshes and waded through the brackish waters for decades. He understood the rhythm of the Everglades, the quiet hymn of life that thrived in the shadows and the stillness. But lately, something felt different. There was a growing tension in the air, a subtle unease that had begun to settle in his bones. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Elias set out on his usual route. He walked with purpose, the creaking of his boots the only sound that cut through the dense silence. The swamp seemed alive with motion, a subtle shifting of the waters, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds. But there was a heaviness to the sounds, as if the very air was holding its breath. He came to a small clearing where a few mangroves stood, their twisted roots gnarled and exposed, rising from the shallow water like ancient sentinels. Here the water was still, almost unnaturally so. Elias paused, his senses sharp, his eyes scanning the horizon. The air felt colder than usual, and the breeze had picked up, pushing through the trees like a warning. Something was watching him. He moved slowly, his heart beating a little faster, though he couldn't explain why. His instincts had always served him well in this place, and they were telling him something was wrong. It wasn't the usual predators, the panthers or the bobcats, that stirred the air. No, this was something deeper, something more ancient. The gators. In the murky waters, the movement was barely noticeable. At first, Elias thought it was a trick of the light, the ripple of water in the fading light. But as he leaned closer, he saw it, the dark form of a massive crocodile, its eyes glowing faintly in the twilight, watching him from the depths of the swamp. The gator didn't move, but Elias could feel its presence, a primal weight pressing down on him. For years, Elias had seen these reptiles as a part of the land, a dominant force in the ecosystem, but never before had he felt such a palpable sense of danger. The gator's stillness was unnerving, as though it were waiting for something. He took a step back, his gaze never leaving the reptile's unblinking stare. As he continued his walk, the atmosphere seemed to grow heavier, the air thicker. The sounds of the swamp grew muffled, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The rustle of the grasses was now drowned out by a low, thrumming hum that vibrated through the ground. The once tranquil marsh now seemed like an eerie, unfamiliar place. Elias pressed on, now more aware of the oppressive presence surrounding him. He knew better than to let fear control him, but this was different. There was an instinct in the pit of his stomach. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, There was a movement in the water. The gator, which had remained still for so long, surged forward with terrifying speed. Elias froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The water around the gator rippled violently as its massive form broke through the surface, the weight of its powerful body sending waves crashing against the banks. But this wasn't just one gator. It was a dozen. The swamp was alive with the massive shapes of crocodiles rising from the water, their eyes gleaming in the dim light. They moved like a silent army, their presence overwhelming. Elias had seen many gators in his time, but he had never seen so. He turned quickly, his heart racing, and made his way back to the small cabin where he had been staying. Every step felt like an eternity, his senses heightened by the growing tension. The world around him felt distorted, the shadows lengthening unnaturally as the gator's massive forms followed him at a distance, keeping to the water's edge, their eyes never leaving it. Elias made it to his cabin and slammed the door behind him. His breath came in short bursts as he tried to steady himself. Through the cracks in the wooden walls, he could see the silhouettes of the gators outside. Their presence was suffocating, their dominance over the land absolute. He knew that they were the rulers of this land, but there was something more here, something deeper, a force beyond nature itself. Evangelism, oldest. As the night fell silent once again, Elias stood at the window, his eyes scanning the darkness. The gators had disappeared back into the swamp, but the sense of danger lingered, the air thick with the unknown. He knew this land, but never before had he felt so alienated within it. The gators were not simply predators, they were the keepers of this land, ancient and unyielding. And now, they had claimed something more. The very soul of the Everglades. In the distance, a low guttural sound echoed across the swamp, almost a growl, a reminder of the immense power that lay just beneath the surface. Elias wasn't sure whether it was the gators or something else entirely, but he could feel the change in the air. The reign of the gators had begun, and the land would never be the same. As the night wore on, Elias lay in his bed, listening to the faint hum of the swamp. Sleep eluded him, his mind restless as he wondered what the future held. The gators had always been a symbol of the Everglades' untamed power, but now they were something more, a force to be reckoned with, a reminder that the natural world could shift and change in ways that no man could control. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the Everglades press down on him. The gators were watching, and soon they would claim their place as the true rulers of this land, a force of nature that no one could defy. In the stillness of the night, Elias realized one thing. He had been a guardian of the Everglades, but now the Everglades had become the guardian of him. As the hours drifted by, the weight of the Everglades seemed to intensify around Elias. The oppressive silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of a bird. The air was thick with moisture, but the atmosphere itself felt colder, like an unseen force had settled over the land. Elias tried to sleep, but the unsettling feeling gnawed at him. Every time his eyelids fluttered shut, he could still feel the presence of the gators, massive, cold-blooded sentinels lurking just beyond the shadows. He rose early the next morning, before the sun had even begun to rise. His instincts had always been sharp, but the swamp now felt foreign to him, its rhythm disrupted by the strange shift in the air. Something had changed, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the balance of the Everglades had tipped. that he had become a mere spectator in a world that was no longer his to protect. Stepping outside, Elias was greeted by the damp, heavy air of the morning. The horizon was still dark, the land shrouded in a pale mist. As he walked toward the edge of the swamp, the ground beneath his boots felt soft, unstable. The waters, which once had mirrored the sky, now churned with an unsettling energy, rippling with unseen currents that made no sense. The gators, too, were still. He couldn't see them, but he could feel their presence, an invisible weight pressing on him. The previous night's events had left him restless, and his mind kept returning to one question: why had the gators appeared in such numbers? He had always known the Everglades to be a delicate balance of life, predators, and prey, each playing its part in the grand scheme. But now this swamp felt different. The gators weren't simply surviving, they were actively claiming their territory, exerting their dominance over the land. But why now? Had something triggered this shift? Or was this just the inevitable return of the land's true rulers? Elias ventured deeper into the swamp, moving with purpose, his eyes scanning the waters for any sign of movement. The sun was still hidden behind thick clouds, casting an eerie pallor over the landscape. The usual sounds of the Everglades, the calls of birds, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, were strangely muted, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to stretch on endlessly. It was then that Elias noticed something odd. A ripple in the water, distant but unmistakable, moved with unnatural precision. A gator's head broke the surface, but this time it was not alone. Another appeared, then another. They moved in unison, as though guided by an unseen force. Their eyes locked onto Elias, gleaming in the dim light, their silent, calculating gaze sending a chill through his spine. Elias froze. The water around him grew restless, each ripple magnifying the tension in the air. The gators didn't move. They simply watched. But as the minutes stretched on, something began to shift. A deeper rumble reverberated beneath the ground, like a distant warning, a rumbling from the heart of the swamp. The gators' bodies twitched, as if responding to some invisible call. Suddenly, a massive shape rose from the water. It was larger than any gator Elias had ever seen, its size almost mythical. Its scales gleamed darkly in the murky water, and its eyes shone like pale, cold embers. It was a creature of ancient power, far beyond the other gators. It moved with purpose, its form slicing through the water with unnatural grace. The others fell into formation around it, as if this beast were their leader, their king. Elias's heart raced. He had never seen anything like it. It was as if the very heart of the swamp had awakened, calling forth its ancient guardians. The gator's presence was no longer just a force of nature. They were a testament to something older, more primal, something beyond his understanding. The massive gator's head turned, locking eyes with Elias. There was no fear in its gaze, only dominance, as if it knew it controlled this land and everything within it. Elias stood motionless, every instinct urging him to retreat, but something held him in place. A strange reverence for the creature, a realization that he was standing before something that had reigned for centuries, perhaps longer. As the creature moved forward, Elias stepped back slowly, his mind racing. His pulse thudded in his ears, but he knew he couldn't outrun this ancient force. He had no choice but to turn and retreat toward his cabin. The gators, still silent and deadly, watched him leave without a single movement, as though allowing him to go. yet ensuring he would never forget what he had seen. The journey back to the cabin felt like an eternity. The swamp, once a sanctuary he knew so well, now felt alien and hostile. He could feel the gator's eyes on him, even as he moved through the thick underbrush, the water at his feet seemingly alive, pressing in on him. The sound of his footsteps on the soft earth was muffled, swallowed by the thick fog that seemed to wrap around him like a shroud. When Elias reached the cabin, he bolted the door behind him, his breath coming in heavy, uneven gasps. He sat down, his mind reeling with the images of the creature in the water, the massive ancient gator that seemed to command the swamp, surrounded by its legion of followers. He could still feel the weight of their gaze on him, a reminder that the Everglades was not a place that could be controlled, but rather a living, breathing entity that could never be fully understood. As he sat in the dim light, the weight of his thoughts pressing on him, Elias realized something that had eluded him for years. The gators were not simply predators. They were the guardians of this place, the true rulers of the Everglades. And now they were making their presence known. The reign of the gators had begun in earnest, and Elias, though a protector of this land, had witnessed something that would forever change his understanding of the Everglades. The swamp fell silent once more, the rumble beneath the earth fading into the distance. Elias could still feel the presence of the gators, but for the first time it wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. The Everglades belonged to the gators, to the creatures that had ruled this land long before humanity ever arrived. And now, it seemed they were preparing for something larger, something that Elias could not yet understand. As the night wore on, Elias could only watch, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the balance of power had shifted. The gators had claimed their territory, and the swamp was theirs. The world would never be the same again. The night stretched long and unnerving, its shadows growing deeper around Elias as he sat alone in the cabin, reflecting on the eerie scene he had just witnessed. The gators' silent presence haunted him, their gleaming eyes still etched in his memory. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had unwittingly become part of something much larger than himself, something primal, a force that was not to be ignored. The swamp, usually a place of refuge, now seemed like a vast, living organism, its heart pulsing with ancient rhythms that neither he nor anyone else could control. He tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. The unease gnawed at him, relentless. The silence outside seemed suffocating, oppressive even. No creatures stirred. No insects sang their songs of the night. The wind was still, as though holding its breath, waiting for something. Around midnight, a low rumble shook the ground, the sensation like the earth itself shifting beneath him. Elias sat upright, his senses heightened, his body tensing in response. Was it the gators moving again? Or was something else at play? He had no way of knowing, but the feeling in his chest, a weighty, foreboding sense, told him that whatever was coming, it was something he could not predict. Suddenly, a sharp crack from the forest outside shattered the silence. The sound was familiar, a tree or a branch breaking, but it wasn't the ordinary sound of the swamp's nightlife. This was different, a deep, deliberate sound. Elias's pulse quickened. He rose cautiously, moving to the window and peering out into the darkness. The fog had thickened even further, swallowing everything in its dense embrace. The world outside had become a blurred silhouette, but something felt disturbingly out of place. Then, from the edges of the swamp, another disturbance, the faintest ripple across the water. Too large to be a small animal, too slow and deliberate to be a casual swim. Elias's heart skipped a beat. The gators had retreated into the deeper reaches of the swamp for now, but it wasn't them. This ripple, this movement, was something else entirely. He opened the door, the creak of the hinges echoing far too loudly in the stillness. With his rifle in hand, he stepped outside, the humid air immediately pressing down on him like a heavy weight. The only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the distance and the echo of his own breath. Every step he took felt calculated, as if the earth itself was watching, waiting. The night seemed to stretch around him, an endless expanse of dark water, looming trees, and thick fog. He couldn't see clearly, but the ripples were growing stronger now, closer. The tension in his chest mounted with every passing second, a feeling of imminent danger closing in. His instincts, sharpened by years of living and working in the Everglades, told him this was no ordinary disturbance. As he moved deeper into the swamp, Elias was acutely aware of the stillness surrounding him. It was too quiet. The usual buzz of the Everglades was absent. The chirps, croaks, and distant calls of creatures had all fallen silent. His breath came in slow, deliberate inhales as he moved deeper, his feet squelching against the wet ground. The water, which once reflected the moonlight in gentle ripples, was now a black mirror that seemed to distort with each step. Then, suddenly, from the fog, a massive shape emerged, rising from the water with a disturbing, otherworldly grace. Elias froze. It was too large, too dark. Not a gator, not a manatee or even a large bird. This creature was like nothing he had seen before, its silhouette immense and shadowy, its shape broken and uneven in the fog. Elias's heart hammered in his chest as the form moved toward him with eerie, deliberate calm. He wanted to retreat, to turn back to the safety of his cabin, but his body refused to obey. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot, his eyes locked on the creature that continued to glide across the water, its movement impossibly smooth. And then it emerged fully from the shadows.